Hi, welcome back. I'm Sheldon McLeod, and this is Thinking Out Loud, presented to you by SaltWire. There are many stories that pop up in the run of a news run or news series, and some of them are pretty difficult to get your head around or to understand or conceptualize, or maybe even contextualize what's going on. There was an article not that long ago at SaltWire. Amnesty International calls on France to halt its case against Ottawa's Hassan Diab. And he was a man who was being charged and tried in absentia for a crime that happened in Paris back in 1980, or at least that's my understanding. There has been a letter written by a group representing a number of lawyers and dignitaries across Canada asking for, well, among other things, the Trudeau government to deny a French extradition request in the case of Hassan Diab. And to find out more, we have a chance to speak with distinguished research professor at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University, Robert Currie, who joins us now. And good day to you, sir.
Hello, Sheldon. My pleasure to be here.
When did you first hear of the case of Hassan Diab?
You know, this has been going on for 15 years, this case. I follow extradition matters generally, and I first heard about the case back in 2008 when he was originally arrested. So that's how long this goes. And what was known to the public at that point was that he was wanted as the alleged perpetrator of the bombing of a synagogue in Paris in 1980, and that he had been tracked to Canada somehow. And so I heard about it, and I followed the case for some time. And what eventually, fast forward to 2014, he had been committed for extradition by the courts. The Minister of Justice had ordered his surrender. And then there had been a review process by the courts up to the Ontario Court of Appeal. And it was decided that despite the weakness of the French case against him, which has been acknowledged right from the get-go by every court that has ever looked at this thing, that he should nonetheless be extradited to France to face trial for this case. And then they rushed him out of the country immediately when that decision came down in 2014. So, long answer to your question, that's when I began following. I really became engaged when he was extradited, though, because it looked like there were problems there. And I didn't even know the half of it. And I'm happy to talk about the problems with you.
Right. And this was for an incident that happened in 1980, so clearly a generation ago in many ways. And the evidence, from what I understand, is that there was a form filled out at a hotel that some handwriting analyst said is of this man. And that is the basis by which the charge was laid and the conviction was obtained. First of all, just to set the table here, how does the French judicial system vary from Canadian judicial system that we know?
Yeah, it's quite different from ours, and you can see that right back to the initial proceeding. So in France, the role of the judge is very different. The role is the judge is the head investigator. So the judge does all the investigation, sends the police out to execute search warrants, obtains documents, issues orders to do all of that. And the judge sort of supervises the thing as it goes along, and then ultimately makes a decision after an actual trial as to guilt or innocence. Now, the parties do have lawyers, but the lawyers' roles are more restrained. So we call this the inquisitorial system that they have in France, as opposed to the common law system that we have in Canada. We call that adversarial. People are familiar with that. So when he went to France, when he was sent to France in 2014, Dr. Diab was poked into a maximum security prison reserved for terrorists just outside Paris. And he essentially sat there for 3 years, mostly in solitary confinement, while the French proceedings continued, while the judge continued to investigate, only after 3 years for everyone to find out that the case was so flimsy and had fallen apart so badly that the judge ordered him released and said, we don't actually have enough evidence to convict this man, and we have evidence, in fact, that he's innocent. And so that should have been the end of it right there, but it wasn't. He did return to Canada, but the French prosecutors who were seized of the case, the anti-terrorism prosecutors, continued to press the thing for several years thereafter, to the point that eventually, all the way up to the highest court in France, they said, well, essentially, we have to have a trial. the evidence is no better, and the handwriting evidence was discredited even in the French system leading up to that. But they said, but we have to have a trial. There is there is some evidence. There is the ghost of some indication that he may have committed the crime. So at that point, this is the only point at which he was convicted. They did have that trial. It was a trial in absentia. That's another thing we don't have in Canada, is a trial in absentia. He naturally, Dr. Diab did not go to France for the trial, and they didn't request his extradition either. He was tried in absentia, so not present. He did have legal representation there. But by this time, I've become quite involved in advocacy around the case, and the people who were watching the trial were quite clear on and this was earlier this year, were quite clear on the fact that the evidence was still every bit as bad as it had been before. But the judge was not at all interested in the defense position, was not interested in defense arguments. It seems clear that everybody on the prosecution side wanted a conviction, including the judge. And that is what we ended up with. And it's a miscarriage of justice entirely, because the quality of the evidence let in wouldn't pass muster in any civilized legal system.
And I guess what we're saying is this is a Lebanese Canadian who was convicted in a court at a trial he did not attend, with evidence that would not be considered serious evidence in Canada. And this is why you're calling for the federal government to stop or block his extradition?
That's exactly it. And Canada has a long historic relationship with France, as we all know. And, there's been this sense, I think, lurking that the French justice system is trustworthy, and we should just let proceedings play out, and I suppose we should trust it. And I think a lot of people feel that way until they look at the details of the case and realize that there is something rotten and politicized about anti-terrorism prosecutions in France in particular. I'm not sort of trying to throw their entire criminal law system under the bus. Anti-terrorism prosecutions, though, are very heavily politicized in France, in particular because they have such a terrible history of terrorist attacks having happened in that country. Tragic, terrible things, of which this 1980 bombing is only one. But that is the issue. That's the point at which we said this has always been a case where there simply was no evidence against him. And what we saw from the trial was that the defense was able to lead evidence that he was not only not in Paris, he was in Lebanon in 1980, the day the bombing happened, writing his exams. There were witnesses who put him there. His own university from Lebanon put him there. And yet the court was uninterested in this evidence. So I and Alex Neve, my good friend and colleague, wrote a letter to the Prime Minister saying this has to stop. The Prime Minister, who publicly acknowledged the problems with the case back in 2018, in the letter we point the same problems out that we've been pointing out for years, and just say, look, France, we understand, has requested his extradition again for this conviction in absentia. This can't stand. We're asking the Prime Minister to deny extradition. And the letter was, to our great gratitude, was signed by about 130 other lawyers, judges, and legal types of various kinds.
If, in fact, this request is granted, what does that mean for Mr. Diab and the fact that there is still a conviction and that he is still considered guilty under the law of the country of France?
Yeah, it's a problem. Right? And I'll tell you in human terms what it means is that the same thing will happen to him that happened to him in 2008. The police will show up at his door and take him away in handcuffs in front of his children. And he'll be probably put under restricted bail conditions. The last time he had to wear an electronic bracelet for 6 years. And I think a lot of people don't know, if they give you the bracelet, you have to pay for it. And it's $2,000 a month. Right? So the human cost is terrible. What it will simply amount to legally is that we will be into yet another extradition case, because the extradition case previously took 6 years to litigate, again, because Hassan Diab was fortunate enough to have one of the best criminal defense lawyers in Canada working for him, Don Bain, who was just relentless in pointing out the weakness of the government's case at every turn. But Don was not only fighting the government of France, he was fighting the government of Canada, which has been desperate to extradite Dr. Diab at every turn, to our great shame as a country. And that is the primary message I think we're trying to send to the Prime Minister, is this has to stop. It's a miscarriage of justice. France, at this point, is persecuting Dr. Diab. Canada should be embarrassed, and we should limit the national embarrassment anymore by putting an end to it. But you're right. Problems for him is he's a wanted fugitive because there is an arrest warrant that has been issued for him by a court in France, and that interferes with your life in all kinds of ways.
Not to assume a motivation, but why would this be important? Not to say that a crime should go unpunished, but that there should be a relentless pursuit of someone with such circumstantial or flimsy evidence.
Well, that speaks to the French side, and I mean, I'm not an expert on French culture or politics, but what I do know about this case is that there is a powerful lobby that has worked on behalf of the victims ever since 1980. This bombing was horrible. It was a hate crime. People were killed. It was clearly directed against Jewish people. We all want the perpetrators of this crime to be punished. And so I think some of the relentlessness is there. It's well motivated, even if it's misplaced. And we can all agree that we want the bad guys to go to jail. But this proceeding has been a round up the usual suspects situation. Here's a guy about whom there were vague whisperings in unsourced intelligence, the origin of which the government of France doesn't even know, that he might have been involved. All of the meaningful evidence indicates that he wasn't involved. There's fingerprint evidence that excludes him. There's palm print evidence that excludes him. It's crazy, this case. And people wonder why I've been going at this now for 5 or 6 years. It's astonishing how bad the evidence is. But I think there is intense pressure in France to do something, to get a conviction. Sadly, they don't seem to care who they convict.
And he is Canadian, and he is a citizen of this country, and the Prime Minister has a lot of things to worry about right now. How successful, how likely is it that this case will again get his attention, and perhaps he will engage and step in?
I think we can be hopeful. Certainly the case has been raised with the Justice Minister as well, who is the ultimate decision maker in these things in terms of the extradition law. We have been communicated with the Justice Department a great deal. We communicated directly with the Prime Minister at this point because he had been personally engaged before. And so we feel that the best route is to say, Prime Minister, you told us when Dr. Diab was returned the last time, this should never have happened to him, and it should never happen again. And respectfully, the letter is very respectful, I think, it's time for the Prime Minister to keep that promise.
And I assume the implication is if it can happen to this man, it could happen to any of us.
Well, that's a great point. Extradition is kind of obscure. Most people didn't know much about it until the Meng Wanzhou extradition case happened, and then that was in the news every day. But that's exactly right. Imagine that a country that we tend to trust, like France, a Western European democratic country, could engage in this kind of kangaroo court proceeding against a Canadian citizen. I couldn't put it any better than you did, Sheldon. If it could happen to him, it could happen to any of us. God forbid you go to Mexico or Costa Rica or somewhere, or Spain, and go off resort and get in trouble with the local police. And maybe there's corruption, maybe there's a misunderstanding and something bad has happened. One thing that we know is that Canadian extradition law is conditioned to provide extradition, right? There are problems with fairness in the proceedings. The law is very much tilted towards extraditing people, to the point where I try to tell this to people, your government will fight tooth and nail to extradite you to a foreign country if they decide that they're going to answer the request. And that's so disturbing that parallel to this case, a number of us, including Mr. Neve, have been working on trying to reform Canada's extradition laws. And just today, this really was a coincidence. Nobody would believe it, but it was a coincidence. the House of Commons Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights has released a report following hearings that they held in February around the idea of reforming our extradition laws. And to some surprise, the committee unanimously has recommended that our Canadian extradition laws be overhauled in a profound way. So that's very encouraging. It doesn't help Dr. Diab at the moment, but it is an area of law that needed some light shone on it. And I'm very heartened that that's happening now.
And I'm very grateful for your explanation about why this is an important case and why you've been involved and why you have added your name to this letter calling for the Prime Minister of Canada not to extradite this man. Professor, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure.
Turn off the noise. Tune in to what matters. What matters is information you can trust. What matters is the news you can use to make life's big decisions. Informed healthcare choices, casting the smart vote, or opening that business. What matters is understanding the world around you. Let SaltWire connect you to what matters with unlimited access to the information you need for only $20 for the first year. Become a member today.